In the summer of 2021, I rode my own Grand Tour. For every mile that the pros rode during the Tour de France, I rode 1 kilometre. If they had a time trial stage, I rode a time trial, and I substituted the Alps and the Pyrenees for the Mendips and the Brecon Beacons. Over those 3 weeks, I rode 2,100 kilometres and climbed 21,000 metres of climbing in 21 days. I managed to raise £18,000 for a breast cancer charity that helped my family out in 2020 when my wife was diagnosed and treated. But there were other reasons that I wanted to do this. Primarily, over the last 35 years or so, I've always wondered whether I could have been a pro cyclist. And this was my challenge to myself, to humanise it and amateurize it and see if I could do it. Now in this video, I'd like to try and explain a little bit about how I use Training Peaks to train for it and show you some of the data that I ended up gathering during those 3 weeks. So let's begin by looking at a couple of the main areas of the platform that I think are most useful, and then we'll get into the data from the Grand Tour. There are loads of online training platforms out there you could be using: Final Surge, Exert, Today's Plan, etc, and so on. I've only ever used the same 3: Garmin Connect, Strava, and Training Peaks. What I'm going to do in this video is cover the 2 main things that I use in Training Peaks and why I've gone back to it after a bit of a layoff. Those 2 things being the PMC, or Performance Management Chart, and the fact that you can input your own training into the calendar to see what the output of fitness might be for that week. So let's talk about some of the other platforms first of all. Garmin Connect is completely free unless you're on some of their training plans, which you have to pay for, and its primary objective is to essentially interface with your hardware, such as your Garmin watch or your Garmin bike computer. Garmin Connect, other than when it's being hacked, works absolutely fantastically, and it has an amazing array of metrics, some of which you probably didn't even know existed, some of which you probably don't even know you need, and some of them you probably don't even know that you need. But before I turn completely Donald Rumsfeld on this, let's have a look at Strava.
We also know there are known unknowns. That is to say, we know there are some things we do not know.
If a tree were to fall down in the woods and it wasn't on the Strava, would it get any kudos? It has a limited but excellent free version, but I signed up to Premium last year when I was planning my Grand Tour to use its excellent mapping features. But one of the biggest downsides to Strava is the fact that you can't put in your own zones for power and heart rate and pace, etc. You're limited to what Strava gives you. Now, that has a wider impact on some of the features that I'm going to talk about a little bit later. As I said previously, it has a free version of it, but it's £47.99 a year, or if you want to pay monthly, it's £6.99. And finally, there's Training Peaks, and that's the main focus of what I want to talk about today. So I used this extensively in 2014, 2015, which were my best 2 seasons, arguably. Now, as time has gone on and my focus has slipped slightly from absolutely optimizing my training, I've let my subscription slip. Now, it is quite pricey. It's around about £15 a month or £82 a year. However, with British Triathlon, you get a 40% discount, which I use, which brings it down to a far more manageable, around about £64 a year. Now, for the features that it gives me, I'm more than happy to pay that. Would I pay the higher price for that? I'm not entirely sure I would, despite the fact it's a really good platform. Now let's get into what it is that I think separates Training Peaks from everything else. And essentially, it's pretty simple. Garmin Connect is an interface for hardware, Strava is an online social media platform, and Training Peaks, well, the clue's in the name. It's all about training and reaching your peak. The first thing we're going to have a look at is the Performance Management Chart, or the PMC. I'm going to break down all the little bits of this, so if you're already using Training Peaks but a little bit confused as to how this can help you, hopefully this will explain. So let's begin by looking at the Performance Management Chart that we have in front of us here. This is the last 365 days of my training. So on the right hand side over here, we've got today, yesterday, and what we've got on the left hand side is exactly a year ago. Now let's start off with these little red balls that are floating off of this line. You can see on the left hand side here, there are fewer red balls on the bottom than there are in the middle of the year along here. Now the red balls indicate days that you've done some training on. If they're floating off of this line up here, like these 2 up here, then you did some training on that day. Okay, what about these blue balls? Stop laughing at the back. The blue balls tell you how much you've donated to the Tory party. No, hang on a minute. They tell you what the intensity of the training you did on that day was. So we can see here that this training session, for example, had a training intensity factor of 78 compared to this one down here that had a training intensity factor simply of 22. So let's have a look at the first of our lines that draws through this graph. The pink one is a measure of fatigue, or ATL, what we call acute training load, or fatigue essentially, how tired we are. Depending on the intensity and duration of your session, Training Peaks can work out the impact on your body. It calculates a rolling average over the last 7 days, and it can help you when there are big peaks or sudden ramps. It tells you need to recover. This darker blue line here is the CTL. Now this is probably one of the most important measures that we've got in our PMC chart. It's a measure of your true fitness, and it measures your workout intensity or training stress score over the last 42 days. And along with other metrics, it gives you a single score. A big jump in that score would mean that the load is too intense or too high, and little or no jump or a drop would indicate, well, no progress or a regression. What we're looking for is like this, a steady progression upwards. And finally, this yellow metric. This is TSB. It's the stat that likes to say race. Bit of a niche reference there, sorry. So this yellow line is form, or TSB. That stands for training stress balance. It combines metrics from training load and intensity plus recovery from fatigue, and it will give you a balance between the two. i.e., if you've trained well and tapered well into the race, your yellow line should be peaking. Hence the name Training Peaks. Okay, so let's have a look at some of these with an example as to some of my training. What we've got here on the left-hand side, essentially from the beginning of the year, from March last year up to this point here, is the training for my Grand Tour, and then the Grand Tour itself. So this is the peak of the Grand Tour, last couple of days here. And then as you can see, I pretty much gave up doing anything of any significance right the way until we get to the start of this year here. So this is when my training for this year's stuff has started. This is the bit I'm not most proud of. However, it will give us some really interesting insights into how this PMC works. So let's look at the first part of last year. You can see that there are lots of red dots in the air floating around. This indicates that I was very active in the first part of the year. As we can see, after the Grand Tour, almost all the red dots are sitting on the bottom, which means I was very, very inactive. Let's have a look at these blue dots. So if you remember, these are in the intensity factor of what I was doing. And at the beginning of the year, when I was just trying to get time in the saddle, you can see they're all floating around this area. Now, as I progressed on and started to get fitter, I was able to increase the intensity of what I was doing. You can see we've got higher and higher and higher climbing blue balls here, and actually an increase in lower blue balls, which indicates that spring's coming for a start and the weather's getting better. I'm able to go out for longer, less intense rides, but then on the turbo I was doing sweet spot and higher intensity VO2 max and anaerobic stuff, which is pushing these blue balls up higher. So you can see there's quite a difference from the beginning of the year in terms of the polarization of those blue dots. As it was getting closer to the Grand Tour, it starts to drop back down again. The most intense part, the most polarized part of my training was in here. Okay, let's look at the pink line, the ATL line, or the acute training load. As we said previously, this basically indicates fatigue. And as you can see, there are 4 main peaks leading up to the Grand Tour itself. We've got one here, one here, one here, and one here. And the way that we can use this is that as you reach a peak, obviously you're too fatigued, you need to have some recovery. So you can see down here that I start to decrease the intensity and the duration of my training. We hit a peak here, it starts to drop where I recover. It hits a peak here, I start to drop down and recover. It hits a peak here, final taper into the Grand Tour, and then of course this is pretty much the highest peak and block of fatigue. Now it's unsurprising really that happened, because that's the 3 weeks. Now obviously as I finished the Grand Tour and didn't do any training at all, my fatigue levels very gradually dropped down to the point where I was about as rested as I can possibly be, because I haven't done anything. That's not the full story. The yellow line tells me how good my form is, my training stress balance. So as you can see, with each of those recoveries, as the fatigue starts to drop, you start to come into some form. Now these are the sorts of things that Team Sky were really interested in with Training Peaks all those years ago when they started out in 2010. As you can see, as that training load increases here, and my fatigue increases, and then I recover, I start to come into some form. Now, what I was aiming to do was to come into my biggest form just before the Grand Tour, and I could track this by looking at these yellow peaks. And as you can see, here's my highest rate of fatigue, and then I dropped into some recovery and tapered, and look, this is the highest point in my training in terms of training stress balance. This was as fit and as recovered and ready to do the ride as I could possibly be, just in time essentially to start this 3 weeks of the Grand Tour. This line, as I said previously, the darker blue line, the CTL, is probably the most important factor we're looking for in training peaks. It tells us our accumulative training fitness. Now obviously we're reaching these peaks here, and again there are 4 blocks mainly of training. One here, one here, one here, one here. Now of course they coincide with being at my most tired, and then some recovery, and then me hitting some form. So we can see it all combined here. Now what's interesting I think with the CTL is that at the start of the Grand Tour, obviously I was making my way up with the intensity of what I was doing. I was getting essentially fitter, but I was also becoming more fatigued, which means if we look at the yellow line, my form is dropping essentially. It's come all the way from up here to almost one of the lowest points right towards the end of the Grand Tour. My greatest fatigue resulted in my worst form right towards the end of what I was expecting to see with the Grand Tour. What is interesting with the CTL is the fact that you can see a little drop here. This was the short time trial in week 1. This was rest day 1, and this was rest day 2. So I think it's really interesting that you can see that immediately you have a little bit of rest, there is an immediate sense of recovery for your body. Now obviously if I was continuing and using that 3-week block as training, look at how high my form is after that. It would have been a great time to have raced around this period here, because that's probably my greatest form and my greatest CTL point between here, 183. My form was at 96. Now that would be a great time to have gone and done some triathlons or some bike races or some time trials. But of course I didn't. I basically sat on the sofa, drank beer and ate crisps. Coming into more recent dates, obviously what we can see from the start of this year is a nice steady climb in my CTL. My fatigue or ATL isn't massively high at the minute, although we've suddenly hit a bit of a peak here, just in time for my recovery week next week. And we can see that my form is slowly climbing, but obviously we're not looking to come into any form soon. After this recovery week that I'm going to be having next week or the week after, we should see that rise a little bit. So there is the performance management chart, probably one of the most key things in training peaks and what all the things mean. Okay, this last bit, the second most important thing about training peaks that we don't get with Garmin Connect or with Strava, is the ability to put in some training for the week to come. Now this one that you're looking at here that's greyed out, this is last week's training. So we can see here at the end we've got our CTL, which is sitting at 58, my fatigue, which is at 89, and my form, which is minus 27. Here's all my durations and distances here. What we're interested in is this coming week that we've got here. Now what I've put in is some training sessions that we can see here, duration, distance, average pace, and that will give me a training stress score that will essentially here give me a cumulative idea of where I'm going to be at. So my fitness will have increased 10 points. That possibly might be a little bit too high at the minute. My fatigue will have jumped from 89 to 106, and my form will have dropped 3 further points. Now that means I can plan in a taper and see where I should be heading to and what my recovery would be like. Now this is one of the main other elements other than the PMC chart that I absolutely love about training peaks that we don't get with Strava or Garmin Connect. We can actually predict and see and change our training using this and think, that might be too high. Perhaps I need to reduce my run down by 20 minutes or take out one of my bike sessions or reduce the training stress score, or vice versa. Perhaps my training needs to be pushed up a little bit. I need to have a big block, and where you can increase it in there. This element is an absolutely fantastic feature of training peaks. So a couple of things I forgot to mention in that last segment regarding Training Peaks' PMC chart and Strava's fitness and freshness chart. The reason why I feel Training Peaks' chart is far superior is that Strava's version doesn't take into account swim fatigue and swim fitness that you might develop. Now, if you're a triathlete, that's obviously going to be quite a significant part of your week. Training Peaks takes that into account. The other thing is the fact that when you shift your FTP in Strava, it alters the history of what you've been given. So it's not a true reflection of how you've got fitter. A training session from 6 months ago as you got fitter would show the same in both areas, whereas on the PMC chart in Training Peaks, it would show an improvement. Now, I hope that video has been of interest to some of you, both in regard to how Training Peaks works, but also some of the data from the Grand Tour. If you've enjoyed watching this video and you're into swim, bike and run, and you're into tech, and you're into a few little reviews here and there, and a little bit of mindset stuff and a bit of sports science, then please consider subscribing and hitting the notifications bell. If you've enjoyed this video, give me a thumbs up and leave a comment, and I will see you on the next video.